It was the kind of DC morning that settled in your bones, a late autumn chill that crept through the marble halls of the Capitol like an uninvited whisper. The wind outside stirred the leaves into rust-colored flurries, but inside, the heat of politics was rising fast. Cameras buzzed. Reporters whispered. A hearing was underway. Not just any hearing, the one. Tensions were thick, alliances shaky, and at the center of it all sat two men, both veterans of the political arena, both seasoned in strategy, rhetoric, and warfare, but only one would walk away with his integrity intact. Senator John Kennedy, of Louisiana, leaned back in his chair, his fingers laced across his stomach, eyes half-lidded, looking for all the world like a man at ease. But beneath the soft southern accent and folksy metaphors, there was a razor-mind one honed by decades in law, policy, and the muddy trenches of American politics. He was sharp, deliberate, and surgical when needed. He had built a reputation for being disarming equal parts, country wisdom and courtroom grit. Across the hearing room sat Peter Navarro, former White House trade advisor, embattled and brimming with fire. Navarro was a man shaped by trade wars, political wars, ideological battles. He wore his disdain for subtlety like armor and came armed with insults sharper than most people's facts. And today, he came loaded. Let's call it what it is, Navarro snapped, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Senator Kennedy talks tough on China, but he's their favorite American. Soft on trade, soft on tariffs, and every time the CCP sneezes, he's there with a tissue. The room gasped. Staffers froze. Even the C-SPAN crew blinked. Kennedy didn't flinch. He uncrossed his fingers, sat forward slowly, and gave Navarro a long, measured look. Not angry, not shocked, just ... disappointed. Mr. Navarro, Kennedy said, voice as smooth as cane syrup. You've said a lot of reckless things in your day, but I'd ask you just once to speak with more brains than volume. Navarro sneered. It's just the truth. You're too cozy with China to see what's coming. You like to talk like a patriot, but I don't think you'd recognize a communist if he bought you breakfast. That was it. The moment the room tensed on, and then Kennedy did something unexpected. He stood, he didn't shout, didn't insult, he just ... told a story. You know, Peter, Kennedy began, pacing slowly as every eye locked onto him, when I was 12 years old. I watched my father, who served in World War II, sit at the edge of his bed, holding a photograph of a man who never made it home, his best friend, shot down over the Pacific. And I asked my daddy why he cried every year on that same date. He paused, just long enough. He said, because freedom costs more than you'll ever want to pay, but if you're lucky, you'll never have to. Kennedy turned to face Navarro fully now. So don't you ever question my loyalty to this country. I've stood in rice paddies in Vietnam, not as a soldier, but as a young man helping to rebuild what we destroyed. I've read every briefing on the CCP that exists. I've fought for American workers my whole career quietly, without throwing rocks at the moon for attention. A beat. You want to attack China's influence? Fine, so do I, but you won't do it by turning patriotism into a weapon. And you won't do it by calling the men and women in this chamber traitors for disagreeing with your tactics. The room was silent. Even Navarro sat still, his mouth open just enough to betray the fact that Kennedy had, in 6 sentences, dismantled the entire premise of his attack. But the story doesn't end there, because for Kennedy, the challenge wasn't Navarro, it was deeper. It was the slow erosion of civility, the creeping infection of performative politics over real work. He'd begun to feel it, even within himself, pressure to go viral instead of go thoughtful, to burn bridges instead of build policy. And that tension was mirrored in a subplot that few knew about. Kennedy's relationship with his son Thomas, a tech entrepreneur in San Francisco. They hadn't spoken in months. Their last conversation had ended in shouting Kennedy accused Thomas of being too idealistic, too naive about foreign policy. Thomas accused his father of selling out to a broken system. It haunted Kennedy. Late nights in his Capitol Hill office, surrounded by books and speeches from greater men, He wondered if the political machine had made him harder than he ever intended to be. If he'd lost the thread of who he once was. But that day, that moment shifted something, because after the hearing, as Kennedy walked back to his office, his aide handed him a phone. "Sir, you got a voicemail." From Thomas. He listened. "Dad." The voice said, uncertain but sincere, "I saw the clip. You were right, not about everything ... but about fighting the right way. I'm proud of you." Kennedy didn't cry. He just smiled. Because sometimes, the hardest battles aren't on the Senate floor, there at the dinner table. In the phone calls that never come into words we forget to say until it's too late. The second subplot unfolded quietly, 2-1. You'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Back in Louisiana, a steel plant Kennedy had been fighting to keep open for months. Received a new federal investment grant, one he'd lobbied for with quiet persistence, not fanfare. Hundreds of jobs saved, families spared, but no cameras, no press release, just work, done well. As for Navarro, he didn't offer an apology. But in the weeks that followed, his public tone shifted, slightly. Like a man who'd been reminded that words carry weight, especially when flung in public. He remained fiery. Yes, but something about that hearing lingered in his eyes. Kennedy returned to his office that evening, and stood by the window. The city lights flickered below, each one a life, a story, a voice that counted. He poured a glass of bourbon, not to celebrate, but to reflect. His father's words came back again. "Freedom costs more than you'll ever want to pay." He whispered the rest aloud, to no one in particular. "But if you're lucky, you'll never have to." And maybe that was the point of it all, not to win the fight every time, but to fight it right. To keep the torch burning for those who couldn't. To speak truth when lies were louder. And to remember that patriotism isn't a volume, it's a vow. The lights of DC blinked quietly on. Indifferent, but something had changed. A senator had stood his ground, not for a soundbite, not for applause, but for something much older, much purer, honor.